The war ended for them not with a battlefield surrender, but with a slow collapse. No front line broke dramatically. No commander gave a final order. The structure around them simply stopped functioning, the way a building does not fall all at once but loses one wall, then a ceiling, then a floor, until what remains is not a building at all, but a memory of one. By the final winter of the war, entire support networks had disintegrated across Western Germany. Female auxiliaries attached to Luftwaffe airfields, signals units, and administrative posts found themselves cut off from their commands, without formal orders, without transport, and often without food. Some were told to walk west, others were never told anything at all. They simply understood, the way people understand things, at the end of systems, that staying meant capture by armies coming from the east, and that heading west, toward the Americans, toward the British, was the only direction that still had any logic attached to it. So they walked. For many of these women, the march lasted not days, but weeks. Roads were clogged with the wreckage of a retreating army. Convoys moved, stopped, moved again. Villages were full, and then suddenly empty. Farmhouses burned. Supply routes closed without warning. Some women traveled in groups of a dozen or more. Others walked alone or in pairs, following the sound of artillery as a crude compass, staying ahead of the Eastern Front while moving toward what they hoped would be a more survivable capture. They wore what they had been issued. For most, that meant standard auxiliary uniform boots, leather-soled, stiff, designed more for standing at a signals post or sitting at a typewriter than for marching across frozen roads and muddy fields in the final weeks of a collapsing war. The boots were not terrible boots. They had served well enough in their intended context, but context had collapsed along with everything else. Over days of walking, the leather absorbed moisture and then froze. At night, the women pulled their feet close for warmth, and the boots drew the heat away before it could reach skin. In the mornings, when they rose and tried to move, the boots had tightened. Not dramatically, not all at once, but incrementally, the way a slow pressure builds, unnoticed until it is no longer ignorable. By the time many of these women reached American lines or were collected by advancing U.S. patrols, their feet had been confined in those same boots for the better part of 2 to 3 weeks without proper removal. Some had removed them briefly and pulled them back on quickly when movement resumed. Others had not taken them off at all, afraid that if they did, they would not go back on in the cold and the swelling, and that a woman without boots in a German winter was a woman who would not be walking anywhere. What happened when they arrived at holding compounds varied by location and circumstance. The U.S. Army was moving fast in those final months, and the infrastructure of prisoner handling struggled to keep pace. Processing stations were improvised from whatever stood near the road: former schoolhouses, gutted warehouses, partially intact factories, farmyards fenced with wire. The women were separated from male prisoners, searched, documented where possible, and assigned to whatever shelter existed. In one compound, near the western German borderland, a large group of German female auxiliaries was brought in over 2 consecutive days. They arrived by foot and by truck, mixed together, different units, different ages, different degrees of exhaustion. Some were in their late teens, others in their 30s. A few had remained composed and upright through the entire journey. Others had to be helped off the vehicles. The American soldiers who received them were not frontline troops. They were a mix of military police, rear area personnel, and a small detachment of medical corps men assigned temporarily to the compound. None of them had specific training for this scenario. The manuals they had been given addressed prisoner handling in broadly applicable terms. They did not address what to do when a large group of women arrived and could not walk properly. The first sign of the problem came during initial processing. The women were directed to stand in a loose formation for a head count, standard procedure. Several immediately shifted their weight awkwardly, redistributing pressure the way people do when standing hurts badly enough that no single position is bearable for more than a few seconds. An American corporal conducting the count paused, looked at the line, then resumed. He noticed, but he filed it away. The second sign came when the women were directed into the barracks building for assignment. It was a long wooden structure, drafty and cold, but enclosed. The floor was planked. As the women walked inside, several were visibly limping. Not the limp of an injury, not the stumble of exhaustion, but a strange, careful movement, the kind that comes from protecting something that hurts to press against the ground. One woman near the back of the group took 3 steps through the door and stopped. She looked down at her feet. She said nothing. She simply stopped. An American private noticed her standing there. He motioned for her to keep moving. She looked at him, then back at her feet, then back at him. She pointed downward. The private did not understand. She pointed again, more deliberately, and said a single German word, the kind of word that does not need translation when accompanied by the right expression: pain. The private called for the interpreter, a German-American staff sergeant who had been born in Cincinnati to parents from Bavaria and who spoke a functional, if occasionally outdated German that the prisoners sometimes found faintly confusing. He made his way to the door. The woman pointed again and said something longer this time. The interpreter listened. He turned to the private. She says she cannot feel her feet properly. She says she has not been able to remove her boots in at least 2 weeks. She says several of the other women are the same. The private looked at the line of women moving into the barracks. He looked at the way they walked. He had not registered it as significant until that moment, but now that he was looking for it, he saw it everywhere. The careful placement of each step, the slight forward lean, the way some gripped the doorframe as they passed through it. He called for the medic. The medic was a 23-year-old from rural Pennsylvania who had trained as a field technician and had spent the previous 8 months treating casualties in conditions that ranged from difficult to impossible. He was not unaffected by the things he had seen, but he had developed a certain economy of feeling that let him work when feeling would have stopped him. He arrived, looked at the woman who had stopped in the doorway, and did what medics do. He crouched and looked at her feet. He did not touch them yet. He simply looked. The boots were standard German auxiliary issue. They had once been a medium brown. They were now dark, with dried moisture, deformed along the upper seams, stiff where the leather had frozen, and rethawed too many times. The laces were fused into their knots. Where the boot met the ankle, the leather had pressed in so deeply that a ridge was visible even from the outside. The medic stood up. He asked the interpreter to ask her how long. She said she was not sure exactly, perhaps 15 days since she had properly removed them. She had taken them off briefly once, early in the march, and forced them back on with difficulty. Since then, she had not dared. The medic asked if there was pain. She hesitated. Not pain exactly, she said. Mostly, she could not feel them at all, anymore. The medic turned to the private and said 3 words quietly. Get the captain. The captain was not a physician but a company commander, a practical man from Georgia who had been handling logistics for 3 weeks without adequate supply. He arrived, received the summary from the medic, and looked at the line of women. He asked how many. The medic said he was not sure. Most of them, probably. The captain was silent for a moment. Then he said, in the particular tone of officers who are solving problems rather than discussing them, all right, let's see what we have. What they had was this: a large group of female prisoners, many of them with boots that had been on their feet for too long, in too much cold and moisture, who were now in a state that the medic described in his notes as likely varying degrees of compromised circulation, potential early-stage frostbite, and soft tissue compression. He could not assess without removing the boots, and removing the boots was going to be its own problem. The women did not understand what was about to happen. They had been placed in the barracks and told to wait. American soldiers were moving around them with purpose, bringing items in and out. Some of the women sat on the rough wooden benches along the walls. Others remained standing, afraid to stop moving after weeks of motion. A few whispered among themselves. The propaganda they had received about American captors was not consistent, but certain themes ran through it. Americans were undisciplined. Americans were cruel in unpredictable ways. Americans would not respect German women. They had heard stories. Some were fabrications. Some were distortions of true events. Very few of them had any framework for what actually happened in U.S.-run holding compounds, because no one who had been through one had come back to tell them. So they waited, and they watched the Americans carry things in. What arrived first was warm water, not hot, warm, buckets of it, military-issue mess containers, brought in pairs by soldiers who set them on the floor without explanation. A second round of containers followed. Some held cloth, clean rags from the look of them, folded and stacked. A medical kit came next, a standard field kit supplemented with scissors, wide-jawed cutters, and several rolls of different materials. The medic set up near one end of the barracks. The interpreter took a position beside him. The captain stood near the door, watching, occasionally speaking to the guards in a low voice. The interpreter spoke to the women. He told them what was happening. He told them their boots needed to come off and that some of them would need help. He told them this was not punishment and not an inspection for contraband. He told them it was medical. He used the German word for it, medizinisch. Some of the women looked at each other. A few looked at the buckets of warm water on the floor. One woman in the front row said something short and skeptical. The interpreter later described it as something like, "And then what?" It was not hostile, exactly. It was the tone of someone who expected the other shoe to drop, the condition that would follow the apparent kindness. The interpreter told her there was no "and then what." The boots simply needed to come off. The medic started with the woman from the doorway. He motioned for her to sit on the bench closest to him. She did, carefully, as if sitting itself might cause something to go wrong. He knelt in front of her. He did not grab her foot. He placed both hands near her ankle and looked up at her and waited. She gave a small nod. He worked the laces first. They were, as he had expected, fused. The wet and the cold had done what wet and cold always do to leather lace in confined knots. He reached for the cutters. She flinched slightly when she saw them. He held them up, showing her what they were. Not a threat, just a tool. He cut the laces carefully, not touching the boot itself yet. The lace pieces fell away. He set the cutters down and returned to using his hands. The boot did not come off easily. It came off the way things come off when they have been on too long, with resistance, with the protest of material that has conformed to a shape it did not intend to hold permanently. He worked it slowly, rotating slightly, never pulling hard. She made a sound once, not a cry, more of a sharp exhale, the sound of unexpected pressure on something that had been numb and was becoming briefly less numb. When the boot cleared her heel, he held it. He looked at her foot. He looked for a long moment without expression. Then he placed the boot to the side and examined the foot carefully. Color, temperature. Response to gentle pressure. He checked between the toes, along the sole, at the ankle. He made notes on a small pad. He worked through the second boot the same way. Then he moved to the next woman. By the time he had assessed a dozen, an informal system had developed. 2 other soldiers had been shown a simplified version of the process and were working alongside him, under his instruction. Remove. Soak briefly in the warm water. Assess. Dry carefully. Wrap in cloth, loosely, not tight, loose, to allow circulation to return without compression. For the women whose feet showed more serious signs, the medic handled them himself. For the rest, the simplified process was enough to begin. The warm water was replaced as it cooled. Fresh containers arrived. The buckets became a kind of rhythm in the room, coming and going, the sound of movement in and out of the barracks marking time. The women who had not yet been seen sat and watched. Some of them had removed their own boots now that they understood what was happening, working at their own laces, and in several cases simply giving up on the laces and accepting help from the soldiers when it was offered. There was no ceremony to any of it. A soldier would crouch, work the boot, set it aside, pour warm water carefully, dry the foot, wrap it loosely, then stand and move to the next person. No speeches were given. No explanations were repeated. The work simply continued. What the women noticed was not the warmth of the water, though they noticed that too, and it was not the absence of shouting, though that also registered. What most of them noticed was the focus. The medic in particular moved with a concentration that was entirely directed at what he was doing and not at what the person he was doing it to represented. He was not looking at a German. He was not looking at a prisoner. He was looking at a foot, assessing it, doing what needed to be done with it. The ideology had been removed from the room entirely by the simple mechanics of the task. For women who had spent years inside a system that imposed ideology on every interaction, where what you were determined, how you were treated, in ways that were never neutral, this was disorienting. It took time to understand. Some of them did not fully understand it while it was happening. They understood it later, in the way certain things become clear only in retrospect, when the emotion has settled enough to allow clarity. One woman, a former radio operator in her mid-20s, who had been attached to an airfield support unit in the Rhine region, later wrote in a journal she kept after the war that the moment that stayed with her longest was not the boots coming off, it was the pause before they came off, the medic waiting. The choice to wait, to look at her, and wait for a small sign from her that it was acceptable to proceed. She wrote that no one had looked at her that way in years, not as someone who had a yes or a no that mattered. Not every woman's feet were badly damaged. For some, the long wearing had been uncomfortable, but not medically serious. Blood returned, color returned, and within an hour or two, they were walking normally enough, their feet wrapped in dry cloth, because their boots were still stiffened and damp, and needed time before they could safely be worn again. For others, the picture was worse. Several women showed signs that the medic cataloged carefully and reported to the captain that evening, swelling severe enough to suggest deep tissue pressure, discoloration that went beyond the typical paleness of cold and into territory that required monitoring. One woman had lost sensation in 2 toes on her left foot, and when sensation began to return with warmth and rest, the pain was significant enough that she had to be helped to a quieter area and given whatever the medic could offer within the camp's limited supplies. The captain read the medical summary that night and made several decisions. First, the compound would request additional medical supplies, specifically supplies relevant to cold weather injuries. Second, a daily foot inspection would be added to morning processing until the medical situation was stabilized. Third, and most practically, the women would not be reissued their original boots until the boots had been dried properly and, where possible, treated with whatever conditioning materials could be found in the area. In the meantime, they wore improvised wrapping and whatever American-issue footwear could be located in sizes that approximated fit. This was not always possible. American military boots were cut differently, sized for different feet, issued in a limited range of sizes for a compound that had not planned on receiving female prisoners who wore German auxiliary issue. Some women wore boots that were obviously too large and walked carefully to keep them on. Others received canvas leggings that could be laced tightly over their wrapped feet. A few were given oversized wool socks layered over their wrappings until something better could be found. It was not elegant. Supply requests took days to process. The front was still moving, and the demands on logistics were enormous. The camp was, in the terms most often used in official correspondence, temporary and under-resourced. But the assessment had been done, the problem had been documented, and something was being done about it in the way that something could be done given everything else that was also happening. Word of the foot inspections spread through the compound. Women who had not spoken up about their own discomfort began presenting to the daily check with small complaints that might otherwise have gone unmentioned. A blister that had become infected, a toenail that had been damaged during the march and was causing pain when pressed, an ankle that had been twisted weeks earlier and never properly examined. Each was assessed, noted, addressed where possible. The medic remarked to one of the other soldiers near the end of the first week that it was unusual work, not the medicine itself. He had done field medicine in worse conditions with fewer supplies. But the context, the quiet of it, the fact that the problems were old problems, problems that had been carried for weeks inside boots and across frozen roads, waiting for a moment when someone might look at them. The women did not become comfortable quickly. Trust was not a thing that arrived all at once after years of the opposite. They remained cautious. They followed instructions carefully and without obvious resistance, but they watched the Americans the way people watch unpredictable weather, alert for the change in pressure that signals something coming. The change never came. The days were regulated, quiet, often tedious, occasionally cold and uncomfortable, but consistent. The rules were the same from one day to the next. The consequences for breaking them were predictable. The guards did not act on moods. For several of the women, this consistency was itself the most surprising thing. They had come from a system where authority was personal and arbitrary, where the temperament of the person giving an order shaped the order itself. A bad day for the officer above you was a bad day for everyone beneath. A good mood might bring small permissions. A harsh one might bring collective punishment for individual infractions. The logic was always available, but never reliable. Here, the logic was different, impersonal in a way that felt, paradoxically, more humane. The regulation existed, the regulation was followed, and within the space the regulation defined, a medic crouched in front of a woman's chair and waited for her nod before touching her boot. The regulation did not require the waiting. The waiting was its own thing added by someone who had decided it mattered. By the time the compound was reorganized in early spring and many of the women were transferred to a larger facility further west, most of them were walking without difficulty. Their feet had healed in the way that most things heal when the pressure is removed and time is allowed to do its work. Some carried small, lasting effects, a toe that bent stiffly, a patch of skin that had lost some sensation permanently. Others carried nothing physical at all and remembered the experience primarily as a compression of weeks into a few key images. The buckets of warm water on the wooden floor, the sound of boot leather separating from skin after too long, the look of a young medic's face as he worked, focused, practical, absent of anything that required them to be enemies. The moment when their feet, which had been carrying them through a collapsing world for weeks without anyone asking how they were finally looked at by someone who expected them to answer. They thought it would be worse. That thought runs through nearly every account, recorded in letters and interviews and journals over the decades that followed. They had been told to expect worse. They had prepared themselves for worse. They had understood that capture meant a kind of surrender of the body to whatever the captor decided to do with it. What they had not prepared for was being asked to consent. What they had not prepared for was a wait. In the enormous scale of the last war, a compound full of women, sitting on wooden benches while soldiers removed their boots, is not a moment that changed anything. No strategy shifted. No territory was won or lost. No report written about it altered the course of the final months. History moves on tracks too large and heavy to be turned by such things. And yet the women remembered it. Not the camp, not the wire, not the cold that leaked through the barracks walls. They remembered the buckets, the warm water, the careful hands, the pause. The fact that someone had looked and decided it was worth doing something about. Sometimes that is what survival means. Not the dramatic survival of battles and escapes, the quieter kind. The survival of the ordinary recognition that a body in front of you belongs to a person and that the person's pain is real and that real things deserve a real response. If you found this story worth remembering, consider subscribing so these moments aren't lost to time. Like the video to help it reach more people and leave a comment below sharing where you're watching from. These overlooked corners of history deserve to be heard.